direct interest, if you like, in what I've been studying. And so yeah, I really appreciate the opportunity. So let's sort of move on. I am going to possibly go quite quickly at the beginning of the presentation and then slow down towards the middle and the ends, because I think that's probably going to be sort of where I talk about findings and things that you know the people here in the room might find more interesting. And then we'll have some discussion and questions at the end. So thinking about my PhD research then, I wanted to begin by telling you what I was doing, where I was doing it, with who and how. So because of my own professional background and experience working in secondary schools for a good number of years, about 15 plus years, as a secondary school teacher, teaching Key Stage 4 and Key Stage 5. I specialised in business studies and economics, and I taught GCSE, A-level and vocational courses such as BTECs. And I was also, for 4 years, a head of sixth form. So I also worked a lot in my career in schools that are in less well-resourced, economically deprived areas. And so what I wanted to do, it was my background really that made me interested in looking at how do vocational teachers sort of participate in university advice and guidance for level 3 pupils studying vocational courses. And just to sort of clarify there, what I mean when I say vocational subject teachers is those teachers in schools that teach courses such as BTECs and Cambridge Technicals. What I found was there was quite a lot of work had been done at FE colleges looking at teachers of those kind of courses at FE colleges, but there hadn't been so much work done with people that worked with students actually in schools teaching those level 3 courses. So my work took place in 3 schools in the Midlands area who all drew their catchment areas, and their pupils lived in what office for students term a low participation neighbourhood for higher education. All my participants in the 3 schools were volunteers. There was 3 sixth form leaders, 1 in each school. There were 5 vocational subject teachers across the 3 schools, and there were 19 sixth form pupils who were taking level 3 vocational courses. Again, they were split across the 3 schools. And as was mentioned at the start, I use Q methodology. So why was I doing the research? Well, when I started sort of exploring in the literature, I came across work by Staffordshire University and Oakley Consulting that commented on the need for research which looked at the variation in practice of information, advice and guidance provided by subject tutors in schools and colleges. But more recently, I was sort of fascinated to read what I think was a brilliant paper by Rice and Hooley, which comments at one point it would be useful to have quantitative and qualitative work with teachers and trainees to understand what they're currently doing in this area and what they perceive as the barriers to greater engagement. And actually what I've been doing in my PhD research does actually contribute a small sliver to actually look at what a subject teacher's identified as doing. But obviously I've focused on university advice and guidance and what they perceived were barriers to them. So why did I use Q methodology? So for those of you that are unfamiliar with Q, Q methodology uses, or it begins by using a card sort, which participants undertake. And you give them a bank of statements and they arrange those cards in a prioritized system, which the researcher records. And then Q methodology undertakes, you input it to a piece of software and it undertakes Q factor analysis, which then draws out commonly held perspectives from all the people that undertook the card sort. So reasons I chose to use Q was that I wanted to people to be able to express their views without feeling intimidated. So I was concerned, particularly in terms of talking to the young people, that if I sort of did something like sat down and interviewed them, that they would feel intimidated. They might just tell me what they thought they wanted me to hear. They might be afraid to say something critical or negative. And actually, maybe even some of the teacher participants may have felt the same way. So I thought that using a cue card sort would be a good way around that. And yeah, that point there that I just made about pupils only giving acceptable answers, what they felt was polite. I didn't want to sort of risk getting to the answers just because perhaps people felt afraid. And because with a card sort, they're given statements and they can represent where they position the cards, showing you whether they agree or disagree with something and how strongly they agree or disagree. Cue is quite a nice way of undertaking that. Cue also, because of the way the factor analysis works, and then the researcher can then interpret that factor analysis data, I think to me, how it felt was it was able to capture the participant views more so than my researcher views, because the analysis of the cue card sort is very much comes from the data. And I quite liked that. Although what I then chose to do, if we move on, sorry, I'm just going to skip over that. What I then chose to do, which Cue gives you the option to do, was not only to do the card sort, but following the card sort, I then returned, having done the factor analysis, and interviewed teachers about the outcomes of the card sorts. And I used the outcomes of the card sorts to actually sort of inform questions that I then discussed with the teachers using semi-structured interviews. And then I did a similar thing with pupils, but with pupils, I had them working in focus groups, but I had them working on questions that came as a result of what they'd sort of put in their card sorts. So Cue gave me, if you like, a good start point with which I could then sort of tailor questions to the groups of participants, rather than me just trying to come up with interview questions or focus group questions, perhaps only informed by literature. So that was why Cue really appealed to me, is that it was going to allow me to sort of access what I felt was two stages, really. The card sort, which sort of suggested to me what people felt, but then the postcard sort activities allowed me to explore with them why they had those thoughts and feelings. So it kind of allowed me to do a two-stage research process, if you like. So the Cue factor analysis delivered four perspectives. The first perspective was that the one that was probably the most strongly felt, and that was that people felt that vocational teachers engaged actively and positively with university advising, that was very interesting. And I thought, oh, this is good, because we're starting by finding out that people felt that they did engage with university advising. Another group of participants in the Cue analysis, however, said, well, we tend to rely more on the head of sixth because we find that vocational teachers are inconsistent in terms of their advising. The third group of participants in the factor analysis came with the outcome that said the head of sixth form has an important part to play in university advising, but vocational teachers do participate, but it can be inconsistent. And then the final sort of group of people, the final and fourth perspective that came out of the Cue factor analysis, was those people that said external speakers who come into school were important sources of university advice to them, because they felt that school staff were inconsistent sources of higher education advice. So that group of people weren't only sort of highlighting that they found vocational teachers inconsistent sources of advice, they were actually saying, all the school staff, the head of sixth, the sixth form tutor, they were all perceived by those particular participants as being inconsistent in terms of their the ability to advise about higher education. So that fourth group were very interesting because they kind of drew attention to the value they placed on external speakers coming into the school as well. But when I stopped and I looked at these four factors that emerged from the card sort, it became very clear to me that the message that was coming across was this idea of inconsistency, that there is participation in university advice by vocational teachers. However, it's not consistent either within the school or across the three schools. It was all coming up as it was inconsistent participation. So then in the interviews and focus groups, I aimed to sort of follow up on why did people think it was inconsistent and what did they perceive were the reasons for that. And what was really interesting when I did the interviews and focus groups, which I then did a thematic analysis. So I took all the data from that and did thematic analysis. Generally, what came out of this part of the research process was that all participants were able to identify that vocational teachers did engage with university advising, but it was a question of, it was very inconsistent. So it was a question of the extent to which they participated. And something that really came out of the interviews and the focus groups was that pupils were very, very interested in degree apprenticeships. They saw those as a really good opportunity potentially to them, and they were aware that degree apprenticeships existed, but they didn't know any more about how to access them, how to apply for them. All the pupils did was they knew that a degree apprenticeship existed and that it was some kind of mix of higher education and an apprenticeship. But what really sort of surprised and concerned me was that the vocational teachers admitted they were really unclear about degree apprenticeships. 4 out of 5 of them said they were very sort of hazy, very foggy in terms of their knowledge about degree apprenticeships, in terms of what they were, who offered them, how they could how they could help students find them and apply for them. But they felt they were potentially very valuable to their students. So they kind of told me they felt very frustrated because they were aware themselves of degree apprenticeships, but they didn't feel they knew enough about them in order to be able to support their students to try and access them in the vast majority of cases of the teachers. So that was something that really came out of the interview and the focus group part of the follow-up. So if you think back to the title of the presentation, I described it as being hazy sunshine, scattered showers and foggy at times. So for the next part of this presentation, I'm just going to make reference to my sort of metaphors, if you like, of weather. So as I just mentioned earlier, the study discovered that vocational teachers participated as university advisors, but not all of them undertook all of these activities. So this is what I perceived as being the hazy sunshine that came out of the research. So I was able to identify through the help of the participants that these vocational teachers were taking part in these specific tasks as university advisors. However, they weren't all doing all of them, and they certainly weren't all doing all of them all of the time. It was very much a kind of patchwork, I guess, would be what came out of this. However, nevertheless, it does mean that we've got some, if you like, some teacher and pupil informed insight into what they think they experience their vocational teachers doing in terms of university advice. So the biggest thing that came out was that participants felt that their vocational teachers helped with subject specific advice. So, for example, that would be things like, if somebody was studying BTEC health and social care, they felt that they could ask their teacher about, careers that would link as a result of doing that course. And the teachers themselves said they felt confident, they felt confident in their subject to actually tell pupils about, well, you could go to university and study social work, for example, as a result of having done health and social care at level 3 BTEC. So that was the first thing that people identified. The second activity that people identified vocational teachers as getting involved in was organising visits to universities. I've put a little star there because there was a caveat. So generally across the 3 schools, people said, yep, they organise visits to universities. Sometimes that is something that some of them do. However, what came out in one school was that the school had the view that they didn't want teachers, subject teachers, to be taking too much time out of schools to take pupils on educational visits, because they perceived that if teachers took pupils out of school on educational visits, for example, somewhere like a university, that meant that other classes who that teacher was responsible for, and in particular a concern was key stage 4 classes, would then miss out on lessons with that teacher and obviously have to have a cover teacher. And that was being used. So the school's view was, well, if trips are being organised, the teachers might organise them, but actually then they had to be manned by support staff, not the teachers themselves. And that created numerous problems within the school in terms of, teachers then just didn't seem as willing to engage with, it was like, well, if I organise a trip, I'm not going to be able to take part, so I'm not going to see what my students see. I'm not going to experience what they do. So this teacher that told me about this said, it tends to be a barrier. And he said he felt that was a pity because it was a barrier in terms of it was a disincentive for people to organise trips, but also he said it was a missed opportunity for teacher CPD because he had been able to organise a trip, and he said, having sort of fought his case, he said that was actually really good CPD for me as well as benefiting the pupils. So that only came out in one of the 3 schools, but it just struck me as well, on the one hand I could understand what they were saying, but on the other hand it seemed really sort of counterproductive. And so yes, so that's why there is a star there. Another activity identified that vocational teachers take part in was that they discuss their own higher ed application and their experiences, and pupils really valued this. In fact, I got the impression that I'm not sure that teachers realise how much pupils value hearing about their own teachers' higher ed application and higher education experiences. So that was something that came out that teachers sort of readily do. And it's also something that if teachers are made aware of this, it's actually very easy for them to do. And they could do it on a fairly regular basis, and that doesn't require any extra training and things, but it does mean that they need to be aware that pupils value hearing about their own teachers' experiences of higher education. The other sort of main thing that was identified was that they make reference to lessons to they make reference in lessons to university and graduate careers. that are accessible to pupils who do their course. So teachers told me, you know, oh yeah, we do try and, like, on a regular basis, draw pupil attention to the fact that, you know, if you're studying BTEC business, you could consider a career in, I don't know, marketing. And so in order to get a career in marketing, maybe you need to think about, you know, applying for a course at higher ed in marketing and so on. Um, and the pupils as well, not all of them, but a number, and quite a strong number of pupils did say, you know, yes, there are some times that teachers tell us in lessons, you know, what careers or university courses we can do as a result of studying their course. So that struck me as quite interesting, because that obviously relates to Gatsby Benchmark 4. But again, it was the fact that this was inconsistent, it seemed a great pity that, so some teachers are doing it, but not all teachers. Some pupils were saying, yes, we've experienced this, but not all pupils. But it was definitely something that was, you know, going on within these classrooms. And finally, oops, sorry, I hit the key twice then. Um, the sort of, I suppose, the general overview that came out of the sort of follow-up qualitative interviews and focus groups was that overall, vocational teachers were also perceived, as well as these 4 very specific things, they were perceived as contributing in ways that help pupils consider university and complete UCAS applications. So, you know, helping them with their personal statements, helping check it, proofread it, helping them with, you know, any questions they got as they were going through that online process and so on. But that was kind of all just where pupils said, oh yeah, well, if I'm stuck with so and so, then I'll go and ask my teacher after the lesson. So it was more like the kind of generic little things that go on, but that are nevertheless very important. But to me, the first 4 things that we found out there are most significant, because that was actually specific things that were being that they were being highlighted as undertaking. So that's my hazy sunshine. One thing I did ask all the teacher participants was what motivated them to help their students with university advice, because I was interested to, what struck me during the interviews was how sort of animated and enthusiastic the teachers were when they talked about helping pupils with university advice. So that led me to sort of say, well, you know, what motivates you? Why are you so interested in this? What surprised me was that all the 5 vocational teachers who'd volunteered to take part from between the 3 schools, all of them, and there was a good age range between them. The youngest one was about 23, the oldest one was in their 50s. So across a good age range of people, all of those vocational teachers had been first in family themselves to university. And most of the 5 of them identified that their own childhood and family circumstances reflected that of many of their pupils. So they identified that they come from families and with low incomes, that they came from areas of sort of low participation in higher education. One of them, you know, said that her parents had spent most of her childhood life, her parents had been unemployed. So I remember that particular person said, you know, I didn't have ideal role models, was how she described her experience growing up. So it was really interesting to me that they identified themselves as sharing circumstances with the kind of young people and the kind of schools that they now taught in. Out of the 5 vocational teachers, only 1 had attended a Russell Group university. The others had all attended post-1992 universities for their degrees. And what they said was the powerful motivation for them was that they had encountered difficulty in accessing higher education, and that having had that difficult experience themselves, they were trying to, and they were interested in ways to actually try and make that easier for their own pupils that they taught. And that was a big motivation for them. I'm then going to look at the barriers that impede them in their participation as university advisors. So this is the bit I've called scattered showers. What were the things that they felt got in the way of being or taking part as university advisors? The biggest thing that came out here was that they highlighted no training from initial teacher training providers, and certainly no training in schools, and no CPD time being devoted to this in schools, even though they are teaching sixth form groups, and these sixth form groups will at some point very soon be looking for, applying for jobs and careers and higher education. Another barrier that was highlighted was they talked about practical barriers, logistical barriers. They referenced what they termed poor timetabling. So, for example, again, particularly in one of the three schools, they referred to difficulties created by putting classes back to back. So putting a Key Stage 3 or Key Stage 4 class back to back with sixth form. And they said that what that meant was when timetabling was done like that, it meant they didn't have time to spend after a lesson to answer, if students wanted to stay behind and ask questions about, higher ed or anything they discussed in the lesson, they didn't have time to do that because they had to rush off to their next lesson, which was, perhaps a group of year 8s or year 10s, and the priority would always be to go and rush to your Key Stage 4 class, as opposed to if it was timetabled where you had a whole afternoon of post-16 teaching, that would kind of mitigate that sort of situation. So they made comments about logistical things, creating this rush where they had to rush away from pupils that perhaps wanted a little bit of time to ask questions after class. Another thing that came out, particularly in two of the schools, was that staff cited performance management and their performance management being based on their year 11 group's exam performance. And so consequently, they said that made them feel as though systemically school management were putting pressure on them to focus on their year 11 groups and their year 11 exam results. And so therefore they needed to sort of shift the emphasis of their time to those groups and those results, because that was what, when they had their annual appraisal, that's what their performance management was going to be linked to. And therefore they felt that took away from time and perhaps attention that they might have wanted, and they felt they perhaps wanted to spend with their sixth formers, as opposed to their year 11s. That's, that they sort of indicated that this pressure, this management focus on you must do year 11, you must get year 11 results, was actually having a negative impact on their sixth form students who they were teaching. And then going back to what emerged about the teachers' own personal backgrounds, this is a barrier that I've identified, because they talked a lot about their own background, their own experiences. And I found some work in relation to teacher habitus by Oliver and Ketley in 2010. And Oliver and Ketley talked about teachers having a mindset, teachers having a disposition, which they termed teacher habitus, towards higher education advising. I found this really interesting piece of work. And what Oliver and Ketley concluded was that they felt that the past experiences of teachers did influence whether or not they had a disposition towards encouraging pupils to participate in HE or discouraging it. And so as part of my research, I took the work of Oliver and Ketley, and I sort of applied this idea of teacher habitus to the teachers in this research, but I've extended it somewhat from what Oliver and Ketley first created. And so if thinking about the impact that I identified the habitus of the teachers, or the teacher habitus, on their participation of university advisors, thinking about the 5 teachers who took part, all of them had been first in family to university. Only one had direct Russell Group experience. The others, as I said, went to post-1992 universities. It was that same teacher who was the only one who was developing a small network with local employers. But that person told me that was very difficult. That was a struggle. And they identified that part of the reason they felt developing that network with local employers was difficult was that the school was seen as a school, that was a school in a sort of less well-resourced or economically deprived area, and that perhaps employers perceived that it wasn't necessarily a high-flying school that they might want to engage with. So they identified that developing this network from the kind of school they taught in was actually quite difficult. But what I sort of have theorized, if you like, in my research was that the habitus, the past experience of these vocational teachers does indeed define their experience and their skill at advising pupils in relation to Russell Group or elite universities and degree apprenticeships. And it was my concern that these teachers, or certainly most of them, 4 out of 5 of them, through no fault of their own, their main experience of university has been post-1992. They certainly weren't of the generation where things like apprenticeships and degree apprenticeships were part of the offering that they had when they were applying. And yet, so how can they feel in a strong position to feel really confident if they have, a very able student who they think should be applying to a more elite university, or if they have students asking them questions for degree apprenticeships without any training in CPD, given the background and the habitus these teachers they have and their disposition that's brought them to where they are, how are they going to be in a position to actually advise on things that they haven't experienced unless they are given other support? So my theoretical framework was for the research was sort of underpinned by Bourdieu. And so I came to ask the question, were the schools, the structure of the schools, contributing to the reproduction of inequality in education? And as a result of sort of taking a step back and thinking about all the things that people told me, the pupils and the teachers, the pupils confirmed to me during this data collection process, they relied on their teachers for advice relating to higher education. 15 of 19 of those pupils were first in family. So they said to me, our families don't have this experience, so we need to get advice about university from school. And they believed that they were able to get this advice from school because they regarded their VSTs very much as able to help them with this advice that they needed. The fog is the difficulty that the vocational teachers had in relation to advising on degree apprenticeships. They openly told me that they found them really confusing. And I can always remember one of the teachers said, actually, as a teacher, that's really intimidating, because if a pupil asks me about it, I don't really know what to say about degree apprenticeships. However, the pupils were unaware that their teachers had these limited experiences. So as far as the pupils are concerned, if they go and ask them about applying to the University of Birmingham or applying for a degree apprenticeship with, I don't know, Rolls-Royce, that they just assume that their teachers are perfectly experienced and are able to give them advice. They're not aware of these limited experiences of their teachers. And that put me in mind, I read some work by Pugsley, where she says that, in certain communities, the families and pupils put trust in schools and teachers to be their sources of university advice. However, that may not always be the best decision, the best trust. And when she made that point, and when I sort of listened to what people were saying, I thought, yeah, that's what Pugsley was talking about in 2004, that they just think that teachers will have these answers and the relevant knowledge and experience. And I very much ended up feeling that this kind of traditional model that we often think about in schools in England, where there's a careers leader, a head of sixth form, and you have that kind of model where university advice comes from the careers leader and the head of sixth form. That's in a school where so many pupils are first in family, and in these low participation neighbourhood schools, that kind of model, it can't cope, because there's too many pupils that actually really need more support, and therefore subject teachers would be an excellent way to kind of increase these young people's access to university advice. However, we obviously need to think about equipping those teachers with that skill and experience to give them the confidence to do it. And so I concluded that by schools not investing in training and CPD to develop their teachers, those teachers were being curbed as university advisors. And my own perception is that consciously or unconsciously, those schools, by not investing in their teachers, are contributing to this kind of reproduction of inequality. So that brings me towards thinking about what are the implications for policy and practice. So I've split this into two sections. Firstly, talking about building teacher CPD and networks, and then secondly, the sort of perspective from initial teacher training. So I'm saying here that again, this has been, I'm not the first person to say this, so I'm here endorsing what other people have before me have said, is that policy should consider provision of a defined teacher annual entitlement. They should be given paid CPD days, maybe even linked to their continued registration as a teacher, like they do in the medical profession. But within that, I think the policy should perhaps prioritise certain groups. So, my research focused on LPN schools where you've got high numbers of first in family pupils, pupils that cannot get support very easily from their family networks. And, perhaps prioritise CPD or activities to help build networks with local HEIs and employers in those LPN schools. So sort of a bit of targeting, if you like, I think might be valuable. There possibly is a role. I know everybody expects universities to do everything, but given that, if a university is offering level 4 apprenticeships, if schools, I was thinking about the teacher that said to me the difficulty in trying to connect with employers. And so I wonder where the policy could sort of ask universities who are participating with level 4 apprenticeships to actually be a bit of conduit and help teachers and schools in LPNs access employers. Or could policy even consider attaching conditions to large employers' apprenticeship levy funded courses? So, for example, add something in saying, well, if you want to run your apprenticeship levy funded courses, as a condition of that, we want proof that you are comprehensively networking with LPN schools and their teachers and pupils. So could an incentive be built in to encourage employers to work with some of these schools in quite challenged areas to kind of try and redress the balance, to help young people who don't have access to lots of social capital and support networks through their families, to help them access it through school and try and even up some of the gaps that way. Maybe that's something that could be thought about. In terms of implications in relation to teacher standards and initial teacher training, again, I agree here with things that I've read others, asking for. So all subject teachers, we could build something into the latest version of teacher standards to talk about the need for teachers to access training in relation to careers and HE advising. I know that was David Andrews was talking to me about how that was, in 2021, we came very close. There was something talked about including this in the teacher standards. But then when the final version came out very recently, the latest version of the teacher standards doesn't have that requirement in. And I think that's very sad. That was definitely a missed opportunity. But again, within teacher standards, it would be lovely if we could think about prioritizing, support for teachers in schools where there are kids with less opportunities, and possibly even considering extra support for teachers who might, I've put here, teachers who might have experienced less advantaged HE trajectories. And that was thinking about the teachers who took part in this research, that if you have, been first in family yourself, you went to a post-1992 university, you've then started teaching in a secondary school, how and where are you going to have got the experience of, being in a Russell Group university, knowing what their teaching might be like, knowing the kind of atmosphere there is in a Russell Group university compared to your post-1992 university? Let's try and give people, when they're training as teachers, these opportunities to experience even just a little bit, so that they could have a little bit of insight, which might just mean they are able to feel a little bit more confident. So I've suggested here that within an initial teacher training, maybe we could consider things like an additional week's placement added, where secondary trainees engage in a week's teaching and learning activities in elite universities. And also, could we consider something like secondary teacher trainees being required in the latter part of their placement to engage with 2 local employers in various ways? That could be open for discussion, but just to emphasise during teacher training this importance of subject teachers being encouraged and allowed time and space to engage with employers. So what were the takeaways really through this research? What would I sort of say are the key takeaways? Well, we started at the beginning, particularly thinking about the work by Rice and Hooley, which said, can we look specifically at what things teachers do in terms of careers and higher education advice? So this research identified 4 to 5 ways in which vocational teachers do engage in higher education advising, albeit it's not consistent at the moment. First in family pupils identified their dependency on teachers and schools for advice. So again, I appreciate that's been identified in research in the past, but we're sort of at 2025 now, and this is still the case. First in family pupils are still dependent on their teachers for university advice. So we need to, in my view, we need to be thinking about how are we equipping teachers to actually be really good at this so that they can support these young people. I feel it was so clear from the research, the personal background, the habitus of these teachers was a really powerful motivator that made them really care about trying to help their young people that they taught. But equally, their habitus limits them. Um, and that is compounded by a lack of training and networking opportunities available to those teachers. And I think what I've called the fog amongst those teachers in terms of being able to advise about their pupils about degree apprenticeships, I find that very concerning, because actually for some of these young people, a degree apprenticeship could be just the sort of thing they're looking for. And it's also really concerning because there's quite a lot of research that's been done in the last 3 or 4 years, which demonstrates that degree apprenticeships in England are or tend to be the haven of more affluent pupils from more affluent backgrounds. So therefore, that makes it even more concerning, because if teachers are not confident advising about degree apprenticeships, and particularly teachers who work in schools where we've got low participation, then that trend of degree apprenticeships being a haven of those from more affluent backgrounds is going to continue. And my own view is that doesn't benefit industry, and it certainly doesn't benefit young people. And finally, policy could begin to bring about changes to address these inequities faced by these first in family pupils in these LPN schools. And, we could be trying to achieve higher quality, better informed guidance from trusted teachers, because teachers for these young people are trusted sources of university advice. So they're very, very valuable. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for your attention. And if I stop sharing my screen, it would be any feedback, any questions that you are able to offer me. And I would do my best to answer questions.
Thank you very much, Alison, for this very clear and thoughtful presentation. Because I'm conscious of time, I'm going to start immediately with the questions. Natasha?
Hi, thank you. That's really interesting, Alison, but equally depressing. We're still in that position.
I don't want to depress you on a Friday afternoon.
You haven't mentioned the Careers and Enterprise Company. Did you take into account any of their work and that of the careers hubs? Have you engaged with them at all? Be interesting to know that.
I am aware. I'm aware of the Careers and Enterprise Company. The issue that I had, and I have obviously read. I mean, obviously they've done extensive amounts of work. The issue that I had was within the PhD, you end up having to focus and really sort of drill down onto a specific thing that you do. And so I chose, if you like, to focus very much on the university advising end of the spectrum, as opposed to the more larger careers advice part of the spectrum, which would have made it, for my purposes, too broad. But yes, so my work is just a very, I mean, obviously it's a small study, it's 27 people in 3 schools in the Midlands. So I appreciate it's very niche, but equally, it just struck me as being quite powerful because there are 3 different schools, 2 different cities, one in a county location, but actually the experiences of the teachers and the pupils were really similar. So for me, that has a message. What would be really interesting would be able to sort of like scale it up and do something on a larger scale, to find out more about this pattern.
Yeah, I mean, I'm from a business board network, and our members typically run the careers hubs around the country. So if it's okay, I'll get in touch with you afterwards, because I think they'd be really interested in hearing this. And there's some other networks who'd be really interested in hearing your work. If you're happy to
Yeah,
repeat
but I
repeat the
equally I
presentation.
would be really interested to engage with them, and I'm sure I can learn from them as well. So yeah, that would
Lovely.
be brilliant. Thank you.
No worries.
Excellent. Thanks. Tom?
Great, thank you. Firstly, thank you for your presentation. It was yeah, really, really insightful. Yeah, I really enjoyed learning about Q methodology. I found your data really yeah, really interesting and really engaging. I've got a question about, I guess, your solution, which is this focus on CPD, which I think I agree with in general, but I think I've just got more specific point. I think I just have a bit of a concern in general that increasingly education just places more and more focus on the teacher, that the teacher is expected to work harder and harder and become more and more expert in order to deal with the well-being issues that their pupils face, the academic issues, the career issues, so on and so forth. I just wondered, is there a danger with taking a very well-meaning thing of saying we need to particularly equip teachers in from vocational backgrounds who are working in deprived areas? Is there a danger that we end up saying, okay, so teachers need to work harder, but particularly teachers from more from less middle class backgrounds of vocational subjects, or what they need to really work harder, and that actually what seems like a good solution just ends up entrenching some issues around class privilege that already exist in the educational system?
I think that's a really interesting point, Tom, and I wish we'd got longer to sit and talk
Yeah,
about that. I actually believe that at present the teachers in those schools are working harder than teachers in more affluent areas, because if you teach in a more affluent area, I know there's work by Jesse Abrahams and things that sort of talks about how schools don't have that pressure because families and parents kind of do all the HE guidance, and you know they take the responsibility away from the school. But I think there has to be a solution, and I think if I'm honest, I think it's bigger than just the CPD. I would like to sort of wind back and look at education more generally, which I know is a really big thing, and I haven't sort of written that in my thesis because that's probably too big to be talking about. But my own view is that if we could just take a big step back and sort of stop this sort of I agree with what you're saying. We expect schools to fix every problem in society, but actually we need to just sort of pare things back a little bit and focus on what really matters. And to me, particularly as being an ex-business teacher, one of the most important things is equipping young people for what happens to them after school. And that a lot of that involves being able to find a way into a career or education and continue with your education, whichever one you do. But if you can do that successfully, you're probably going to then go on and be mentally more healthy because you've got a pathway that you're on, you've got skills that you can transfer into different spheres. And yeah, in my heart, I would just like to take a big step back and sort of change how we look at the whole system. But I appreciate that would need to be done in micro steps. You can't just wipe the slate clean, which is what I'd really like to do in my ideal world.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, no, it's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think it's just there's quite a difficult balance with some of these things around teacher CPD. I know other people in this call I've done quite a lot of research in this area, so don't take away from that. But yeah, it just really sort of struck me. So
yeah, maybe we should have a coffee one day and just sit and talk about this, because I'd really enjoy that.
Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question, Mika.
Thanks, Alison. It was really fascinating to hear about your research. Maybe to loosely continue what Tom was asking you, because the way I understood your presentation is that you described many of the barriers being structural or organizational or due to the system. So I was just wondering that did the teachers discuss or make reference to any sort of peer support or other sort of things that they would benefit from each other? Because I also got the idea or the impression that they are quite lonely in their jobs. So was that discussed in any ways with them?
I think you're right, and I think you've picked up on something really interesting there. Is that no, that they didn't see peer support as being particularly a solution. It was almost like they felt like they were all in the same boat, and that actually there wasn't, because I can remember in one interview I said to someone, because they were all three schools were part of academy trusts. I should have probably said that, sorry, at the beginning. But at one point this person was identifying the sort of void there was in training and experience within the school, and I said, well, is there no one in one of the other schools in your academy trust that could help with this? And they kind of looked at me and said no. And I said, but I thought this was one of the whole principles of academy trusts, was that you were supposed to have a network of support with across your schools in your trust that you could then cross draw upon. And they sort of said, well, that's not happening in terms of university training on university advice and guidance. They didn't say it wasn't happening in relation to other topics, but because we were talking about university guidance, they said that wasn't it wasn't happening. And it does, you're right, it did feel as though they all felt as though they were in a similar boat. But what they didn't realize that I could see, because I was doing it across the three schools, I could see that across three schools they all had similar these, as you put it, lonely experiences, which I just find really interesting.
Yes, thank you. Yeah.
But it's also very concerning.
It is, yeah. I mean, I was just wondering if that was like one way forward to create these sort of peer contacts or make it more visible that everybody's in the same, or most of the people are in the same situation.
Yes, which is, yes, and I think that might help, but equally, but you need, if everyone's in a position of none of us are really confident about this, need to put something in place so people can get those skills and be confident.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Alison. If that's okay with you, I'm going to share your email address on chat. So participants can get in touch with you or continue the conversation. Thank you to all of you for joining us today, for the quality of the questions and discussion. It was lovely to see you all. Have a good weekend, and we look forward to seeing you in February. Thanks, Alison, again.